Well, welcome back to our study in the book of Isaiah. Today we are in our second lesson, and today we're going to look at a familiar passage for some of you, but it might be a new and exciting passage for some others. And so we're going to dive in this morning into learning about Isaiah's call to ministry. And in this passage, Isaiah encounters the King. He encounters the Lord of armies, and the Lord puts him on mission. And he says, who will I send? Isaiah says, send me. And Isaiah says, send me, for Isaiah has even any idea what God is sending him to do. Isaiah has no idea how long he's going to be serving the Lord. He just knows God needs somebody, and I'm your man. Well, the reason Isaiah did that is because of what he encountered. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at this encounter between Isaiah and the King, the Lord of armies. But before we do that, let me ask you a question. Is there an experience in your life that you just can't not tell people? You know, there's conversation going, and you say, man, this one time. And it's always that same time. It's that same life experience. You know, it might be that time you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. I don't know. It might be that time that you gave birth to twins. You know, it might be that time that you spent a weekend camping with your spouse or with your best friend, and things just changed. That was an amazing experience. God met you there and changed you. What experiences have you had, and how have they changed you? Today, we're going to look at an experience in Isaiah's life that changed him and shaped him for the ministry that God had for him for the rest of his life. And we're going to learn that God calls people to recognize and declare his sovereign purposes. You know, this challenging event is quite interesting because we know almost exactly when it happened. It happened in the year that King Uzziah died. Now, it probably happened after King Uzziah died, because if it happened before he died, Isaiah would have said in such and such year of King Uzziah's reign or something like that. So probably happened after he died, and King Uzziah died somewhere around the year 740. So in that year, Isaiah had this vision. Now, Uzziah had been a pretty good king. He had, the economy had grown, the nation's borders had actually grown quite a little bit, and in that process, though, Uzziah had done a few things wrong. He had not removed all the high places, so people were still worshiping the pagan gods in some places, but in general, Uzziah had been a pretty good king. And this time of prosperity, the people had flourished as well. The northern kingdom had very similar situation. They were flourishing and they were growing. And Amos and Hosea, the prophets there, they challenged the people and they said, you have forgotten God in your priorities. You have abandoned the Lord's ways in your prosperity. You don't recognize him. And so Isaiah's challenging the people. Amos and Hosea were challenging the people, and we're not in the same situation as them, but sometimes we need to be challenged in the same way they have, because we are a prosperous people. Some of us may have more prosperity than others, but in the Western world, in the United States, we are a prosperous people, and so we need to be careful that we don't abandon the Lord and forget who he is in our prosperity. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and see how God is described. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim were standing above him. They each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of armies. His glory fills the whole earth. The foundations of the doorway shook at the sound of their voice, and the temple was filled with smoke. Here we get a peek into the heavenly throne room, and we get to see God's glory. Now, the word translated temple here could be a word that is translated also as palace. So it seems that we've been transported in Isaiah's vision to a palace temple in the heavenly realms. And here we really get to see what's going on. And how is God described? Well, he's described as seated on a high and lofty throne. He's described as having a robe that fills the whole temple, the whole palace place. And you know, during a challenging time, during times when there's a change in one ruler to another ruler, there can be a lot of confusion and a lot of fear. Now, we don't experience it that much in the United States. When a person loses an election, they normally just pass power on. They cede power to the one who won the election. Even in 2000, when Bush and Gore had a time there where we didn't know who won the election, and there was really a lot of concern and what's going on. We weren't fearful that President Bush would go out and recruit an army, and then Vice President Gore would go out and grab some people, and there'd be a militia, and they would go fight each other. We'd have a civil war. That's not the way things work for us. But in this time, in the ancient world, there's really a lot of confusion when one king passes to another, especially when you have a good king possibly giving way to a bad king. So Isaiah is sitting there, and he looks up, he looks around, and he says, there's a king sitting on a throne higher and bigger than Uzziah could ever imagine. And there's a king sitting on a throne who's got a robe that is more glorious and more astounding and more amazing than any person in the world has ever worn or ever will wear. Times are scary around here right now. We don't know what's going to happen with the kingship, with the rulers and all that. But the Lord is sitting on his throne. And that should remind us that God is sovereign and God is well placed. He is the God of armies. He is the God of glory. And he is the God who is in control of what's going to happen. How do the seraphim describe him, though? They describe him as being holy, holy, holy. Now, we have two choices here. If you're a teacher watching this, you can dive off the cliff of describing a seraphim. You could do that. You could spend time going over to Ezekiel and talk about the images that are depicted there. But I think what's important for us to focus on is not the messenger, but what the messenger has to say. These angels, these beings are arrayed as a chorus behind the Lord, and they are calling out that he is holy, holy, holy. Now, how would you define holiness? Think on that for a minute. They say here not that he's just holy. He is holy, holy, holy. What does that mean? Well, first off, it means that he is the most holy. He is supremely holy. Nobody can hold a torch to his holiness. That's what that means. But what does holy mean? How would you define it? In modern Christianity, we use it as a synonym for sinless. But there's more to it than a fuller definition to that. The Holman Illustrated Bible Dictionary describes holiness as God's perfect holiness, the complete perfection of his attributes, such as power and goodness, is humbling and even terrifying thing when revealed to weak and sinful men. Yes, God is sinless, but because God is not like us, because he created us, because he is wholly separate from us, WHO, wholly separate, he is therefore holy. He is other. He's different than us. How should God's holiness affect how we think about God and how we live for him? Think about that for just a moment. Now, I want you to read Isaiah 6:5. I want you to think about Isaiah's response to God. In one word, how would you describe Isaiah's response to seeing this king lifted up who is described as wholly other and wholly sinless before him? How would you describe his response in one word? Would you use fearful? Would you use humble? Would you use repentant? Honest? What word would you use? Have you ever experienced God in this way and responded in a similar way? I want to give you a Bible skills activity to participate in today. I want you to look up Exodus 33:20, Isaiah 59:3, Jeremiah 9:3-8. And teachers, if you use this activity in your class, just give these different verses to different people to read. How do these passages help us better understand Isaiah's response? What does Isaiah's response reveal about humanity? And what was the importance of Isaiah declaring his sinfulness? All right, let's read Isaiah 6, verses 5-7, and notice God's actions. Then I said, woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips, and live among a people of unclean lips, and because my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of armies. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, and in his hand was a glowing coal that had been taken from the altar with tongs. He touched my mouth with it and said, now that this has touched your lips, your iniquity is removed, and your sin is atoned for. First off, Isaiah realized he had a sin problem in verse 5. And then verse 6 and 7, we see that God offers forgiveness. Presumably under the direction of the Lord of God, the angel took a coal from the altar and touched it to Isaiah's lips. Clearly this is a vision. And so when this happened, though, it represents God's forgiveness of Isaiah. And so I want us to notice a couple of things about this. First off, he took the coal from the altar, or maybe from underneath where the Lord stood. And the altar represents a place where an animal has died to make atonement for sin. In the temple, that's what would happen. They kill an animal to make atonement for the temple, atonement for sin on the altar. And so that's what's represented here. Something had to die. Something had to make it possible for Isaiah to receive forgiveness. Second, forgiveness was initiated by God in response to Isaiah's recognition of his sinful state. God initiated the process. Second or third, Isaiah's sins were atoned for not because of something Isaiah did, but because of something God did. Isaiah didn't go and offer a certain type of ritual to have his sins forgiven. Isaiah didn't go give a bunch of money to the poor to have his sins forgiven. No, God initiated the response to have Isaiah's sins forgiven, and God did the work to make it happen. Think about this on this side of the cross. We look back and we say that Christ died for us. We did nothing to earn our salvation. We rely on Christ's death, Christ's resurrection, Christ's work in our hearts that God will forgive us and will make us right with Him. Nothing we do. Christ initiates that. Christ makes it possible. Christ does the work, and then the Lord forgives us and welcomes us in to His family. So back to our vision, now that Isaiah has been made right, God breaks his silence. God has something to say. He asks the court a question. Let's read verses 8 through 10 and see Isaiah's response. Then I heard the voice of the Lord asking, "Who should I send? Who will go for us?" I said, "Here am I, send me." And he replied, "Go. Say to these people, keep listening, but do not understand. Keep looking, but do not perceive. Make the minds of these people dull, deafen their ears and blind their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears, understand with their minds, turn back and be healed." So here we see God's call. We see that God is on mission. He is on mission to make his people into the kind of people that can be a light to the world. He wanted to draw the world to himself through his nation of Israel, and he was trying to make them into that. That was his mission. God is still on mission today. He's on mission through us to seek and save the lost. And so Isaiah didn't even know how long the mission would take. Didn't know what the mission would entail. But it seems that Isaiah, after understanding how sinful he was in light of God's unsinfulness and the greatness of God's forgiveness, just responded, "Send me." He didn't even check up and say, "Well, what's the rules? What's the job? How much do I get paid? How long does it last?" He just says, "Send me," because he knew the greatness of his forgiveness. And my question for you then is to stop and think for a second, how is our willingness to follow the Great Commission connected to God's forgiveness of us? If we remind ourselves daily of the gospel, if we remind ourselves daily of how sinful we are and how great our forgiveness is, we will answer quickly when God calls us to the Great Commission. So God calls us, and we should answer, "Here I am, send me." And only after Isaiah said, "Send me," did God reveal his mission and his message. And his message was a hard one. And I don't want us to get caught up on the message, because our lesson is not about that message. Our lesson is about God's call on Isaiah's life. It appears that God's message through Isaiah to the people was in response to the people's hardened hearts and to their decisions they'd already made. Romans chapter 1 tells us there are times when God finally just lets the unrepentant do their thing and experience discipline. And that's maybe what he's doing here through Isaiah. And so God calls us to a mission. God doesn't call us to easy missions all the time. God calls us to do what he needs to be done at that time. God calls Isaiah to go and preach and expect no response. He didn't have a whole lot of people follow him, but he had some. King Hezekiah, for one. He answered the call and he followed God for a bit. And so Isaiah sent out on a mission to be, quote, unfruitful. That's interesting. Why would God send him out to be unfruitful? Oh, wait. Our calling is not to produce converts. Our calling is simply to deliver the message that God has for them. Remember that as you go out to fulfill the Great Commission, God didn't call out and say, convert everybody. He says, go out and tell people. Because we know God is the one who makes the convert. God is the one who brings people into relationship with him. We then walk with them through discipleship and sanctification and call it and grow with them and go out with them. So let's finish up though with verses 11 through 13. Isaiah, who is a pastor, has a concern. He loves these people. He has a passion for them. And when God says you're going to preach and they're not going to answer, he's saddened by that. And so he has a question for God. So look at verses 11 through 13. Then I said, unto when, Lord? And he replied, until cities lie in ruins, without inhabitants. Houses are without people. The land is ruined and desolate. And the Lord drives the people far away, leaving great emptiness in the land. Though the tenth will remain in the land, it will be burned again like the terebinth tree or the oak that leaves a stump when felled. The holy seed is the stump. So here we see God's persistence. Remember, this is not about punishing the nation. It's about disciplining them. It's about making them into what he desires for them to be. He says they're going to reject, and they're going to reject, and they're going to reject. And eventually, the nations are going to come in and discipline them and take them out of the land I've given them to another land. But don't worry, there's a seed, there's a small group that's going to be preserved, and eventually the nation's going to come back, and they're going to rebuild in this land, and they're going to be more like the nation I wanted them to be. God is constantly growing us, and we're constantly to become more like him, never actually attaining that in this life, but becoming more and more like him. And that's what he wants the nation to be. And so he's going to let them be disciplined and then bring them back. And so I want us to get a few things about the idea of calling from this. 3 points I want to send you out with this week. We can't go on mission for God until we have been forgiven for our sins and been made right through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Number 2, we act in response to that forgiveness. We should follow him, we should love others, and we should share the gospel. Number 3, the mission of the church is not easy. And it will require our persistence as we remember that God is persistently pursuing us and persistently loving and pursuing those around us. So my question for you this week is, how will you respond to the call of God? As a Christian, you have been forgiven. If you're not a Christian yet, he wants to forgive you and he wants to call you into mission. But if you're a follower of Christ, he has forgiven you and now wants to send you out. He's saying, who will I send? Will you respond and say, send me? Will you recognize the greatness of the forgiveness you've experienced and say, send me? I don't know where you're sending me to, but send me, I'll do it. Well, I want to challenge you this week. Ask the Lord to make you ready to follow his calling.